First, the USDA's Justice for All non-discriminatory statement, which simply states that all persons must be treated equally without regard to their race, color, national origin, sex, religious creed, disability, age, political beliefs, or reprisal or retaliation for prior civil rights activity, and that our institution provides an inclusive space for all. For more information on the And Justice for All statement, please visit the USDA's website.
Hi everybody, welcome to this edition of the Family Foodie. My name is Maddie and I'm a nutrition educator for the Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Mercer County, the Department of Family and Community Health Sciences, and SNAP-Ed. So you may have joined us last time with our first installment of the Basics of Beans, where we talked about how awesome beans are for a lot of reasons, but especially because they are both a protein food and a vegetable, and then also because they pack so much fiber. Today is our second installment of the Basics of Beans, and we will be discussing how to properly prepare and store beans in order to put them into our favorite recipes and things like that, and also help them stay on our shelves for longer. All right, so let's begin with how to properly prepare canned beans. So you'll see here, I have a can of white kidney beans in front of me. This is just a basic can, much like the cans in front of me. When it comes to prepping canned beans, the first thing you want to keep in mind is what you're looking for in the grocery store. So when it comes to canned vegetables, often canned vegetables can be really high in sodium content, meaning when we look at the nutrition facts on the back of a canned vegetable, typically the area that says sodium is going to be pretty high in milligrams. And then when we look at the percentage of the daily value of sodium, that's also going to be high, anywhere from like 10 to 15 to 20% or even higher. So the reason for this is because salt or sodium is a great preserving agent, and it's one of the things that helps cans of beans or cans of vegetables stay on the shelves for so long. However, a sodium and high diet can be really hard on our bodies. It can lead to things like high blood pressure and things that we just don't want. So let's talk about how we can choose beans that are low in sodium and then how we can prep them to be even lower in sodium. So as I said, when you first go into the grocery store and you're looking at canned vegetables and you're looking at canned beans, you want to make sure you're choosing low sodium options, okay? So the way you can look for low sodium options is just by looking at the title of the can that you're looking at, and it'll often say low sodium, okay, or low in salt. And then you can also check and compare different cans by looking at the nutrition facts label. So right now, for instance, if I was at the grocery store, I have my can of black-eyed peas, I have got my can of white beans. If I'm comparing two sodium levels, I see that per serving size, and they have the same serving size, there's much more sodium, 350 milligrams of sodium in the black-eyed peas versus only 220 milligrams of sodium in the white beans. So I would probably, if I was looking for a low sodium option, I'm gonna go with the white beans. All right, so that's the first thing you wanna do when you're already at the grocery store. The second thing that you want to do is the step of prepping these beans. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open them up. My handy dandy can opener here. I'm going to open them up. And they're canned beans, so they're already nice and soft. They'd be ready to put into a recipe. But before I put them into my recipe, remove the lid here, I'm gonna strain them, okay? So I have here just your typical strainer that I would maybe put some pasta in or strain other things in over the sink, the bowl underneath. I'm going to dump my beans into this strainer. Okay, so my beans are all in there. You'll see, you can probably see right now, there's a lot of liquid coming off of those beans, a lot of liquid coming off of those beans. Okay, and then I'm going to take some water and I'm going to rinse those beans as well. Now, ideally you'd be in your sink where you could do this, and then you could just take your faucet water and run them over the beans. It drains right down the sink, you're good to go. But I just drained my beans, just as I would if I were in front of a sink. And what that does is that it helps reduce the sodium by up to 30% in these beans. So I've gone with the low sodium option, I've reduced the beans' sodium content by 30%. So that really helps with lowering the sodium content overall with canned beans, which is just a great thing to do if you are hoping to lower the amount of sodium that you have in your diet and also just have better prepared canned beans. Now that I've lowered the sodium content, I just want to show you the liquid that's in there. So this is also with the water I added to it, but another reason why it's great to drain the beans that you have that are canned is that not only is there sodium in this liquid, there's also the certain types of sugars that are contained in beans that often give them the reputation for upsetting our stomachs and causing excess gas. So if we drain beans before we cook and eat them, it's also going to help us reduce the amount of those sugars that can, end up causing excess gas later on. So that's another reason to drain your beans. Okay, so my beans are drained, they're good to go. I can easily just put them into some type of soup or other type of recipe. They're already pre-cooked, they're good to go. One final note with canned beans is that it's really important to note that, as I said, they're already pre-cooked. So you want to be careful. You don't want to add in, if you say you're making a chili and it needs to simmer for about 30 minutes. You probably want to add your canned beans towards the end of those 30 minutes because otherwise if you let it cook for 30 minutes, it's going to get kind of mushy. You want them to hold up their texture, add them in at the end. All right, so we've discussed canned beans. Now let's go on to dried beans. When it comes to dried beans and dried legumes, there's usually a 3-step process, okay? So the first step that you want to take when it comes to your dried beans is sorting through them, okay? Sorting through them. So let's, for instance, take our dried black beans here. So put them in this bowl, okay? And when I have them in this bowl, I'm gonna pick through them. I'm gonna pick through them. I just opened this up. I found a shriveled bean. Let's see what else I might find in here. I found a pebble, okay? And if I keep on sorting, I'll likely find more items in here that are worth taking out because I don't want to eat them. That's just typically your first step when it comes to dried beans. When they're being processed, when they're being taken out of the field, when they're being put, through different systems, often, beans get shriveled, or maybe there's pebbles, or maybe there's things that we just don't want to eat. So it's important to sort the beans before you cook them. All right, once they're sorted, you want to give them a good rinse, maybe in a colander or a strainer, or even just in this bowl, then let that water go. Once they are rinsed, you're going to want to put them in, it could be the pot that you're cooking them in, it could just be a pot that holds them, okay? So I'm gonna put them in this pot. Because the second step here is to soak your beans. You've probably heard of soaking dry beans. It's one of the things that eventually gives us the texture that's the same as these canned beans. They kind of grow in size, and then they also become more tender and easier to eat. So soaking the beans is a really important step. Otherwise, when you go to cook them, they won't cook fully and you'll end up with kind of these chewy, hard, grainy types of beans that are going to be really difficult to digest and then also just not a pleasant thing to experience when you're eating. So soaking is really important. When it comes to soaking, there are 2 options that you can do when it comes to soaking. So the first option would be a quick soak. A quick soak is when you fill up your pot that you have your beans in to about where there's a half an inch or an inch worth of water over top of your beans. You put that on the stovetop and you bring it up to a boil for 2 to 3 minutes. Once it's boiled for 2 to 3 minutes, you turn your stovetop off, you can put a lid on your pot, and then you let your beans sit for 1 to 4 hours. Once they've sat for 1 to 4 hours, you can put them into a strainer, rinse them off, get rid of all that liquid because that's also where those sugars that give us gas are going to be stored, and then your beans are ready to be put into a recipe to cook fully. That's the first method. It's usually the quicker method, it only takes 1 to 4 hours. The second method doesn't require any heat, however, it does take a lot longer. So the second method would be kind of known as the overnight method. You have your pot of beans like I do here, fill up the pot to about a half an inch or an inch worth of water over the beans. Stick it on your stovetop, maybe stick it in your fridge, leave it out with it being covered overnight, up to 12 hours. The next day, or maybe 12 hours later, your beans will be ready to cook. So you're going to want to strain them again, get rid of all that water that has the sugar that causes excess gas, and then they're ready to be cooked, okay? So those are the two methods of pre-soaking our beans, okay? So we have the quick method where you boil for 2 to 3 minutes, then you strain, and then you have the overnight method where you soak for about 12 hours and then you're ready to cook. Okay, so we've talked about how to prep canned beans, we talked about how to prep and soak the dry beans. So what about cooking? What is it like to cook beans? It seems, especially with the dry beans, it takes a lot of prep time, so how long is it going to take us to cook these beans? When it comes to dry beans, it depends on the type of bean. So for instance, I have here my black beans. I'm gonna have another bag of black beans. I eat a lot of black beans. And this, depending on how high you're cooking it and what kind of recipe you're using and how long you've soaked it, can take 60 to 90 minutes per cup to make. Okay, so 60 to 90 minutes for black beans. And again, that depends on how long you soaked it, depends on how tough or how hard you want your beans to be when you're eating them. Now, what about things like black-eyed peas? So if these were dried black-eyed peas, they take around 120 minutes on a simmer to cook. So that's about 2 hours. And then also our cannellini beans, those would take, like the black beans, 60 to 90 minutes if these were dried and pre-soaked. And then with the chickpeas, these will also take about 2 hours if they were pre-soaked or canned, they're good to go. And then when it comes to northern beans, that's going to take 90 to 120 minutes. And our pinto beans, again, if they were dried, 90 to 120 minutes. Last but not least, we have our lentils. And lentils, much like split peas, right, they're also legumes, they're still in the same family. However, what's awesome about lentils and split peas is that they don't need to be soaked, and they only take about 30 minutes to cook. So you're still going to get a ton of fiber, you're going to get a lot of that same texture and flavor that you really love from beans. However, if you're going with a dried option, they're not going to need to be pre-soaked, so you can skip that step with lentils, which is pretty cool. All right, so we've discussed how to prep all of these different items and these different dry beans, whether it's canned beans. Now let's talk about storing them. So when it comes to storing canned goods, you do want to, when you're in the grocery store, make sure there's no dents or scratches or rust marks on the canned goods. You want to make sure you get the best product possible. Then, these can be stored in a cool, dark place. They can be stored in a refrigerator. They don't need to be. And you just want to pay attention to the expiration date, okay? Because depending on when they've been prepped or when you've purchased them, you want to keep an eye on when they're expired and make sure you eat them before they do expire. So that's how you would store canned goods. Now when it comes to dry beans, for instance, I bought this bag of dried black beans. This can stay in an airtight container for about a year, as long as I'm paying attention to the expiration date. There's no holes in the bag, it's not getting wet or anything. This could last for up to a year, which is pretty awesome. Now when it comes to cooking the beans and then wanting to store the cooked beans, they can last in your refrigerator to 4 to 5 days in an airtight container, maybe something like this, or maybe a Ziploc baggie, but definitely want an airtight container in your refrigerator. They can last for 4 to 5 days. Now when it comes to freezing beans, they can last up to 6 months in the freezer, which is pretty awesome. The one thing you do want to note though, if I were storing freezer beans, so if I were putting some beans in here that I wanted to put in the freezer for up to 6 months, I would want to make sure that I added liquid to the beans that are in this container, because that way the beans don't get freezer burnt, they don't dry out, they kind of absorb that liquid. It helps them for when you want to consume them later. All right, so we've discussed all of these different things about beans. Honestly, it's endless. Beans are beautiful. There's a huge variety. They're really good for you. There's so many things you can do with them. So thank you so much for joining us for this second installment of the basics of beans.